Chapter 8. Highs and Lows. We moved to a far wall and motioned for the rest of the squad to follow. We walked through rows of empty cell blocks before we finally approached a door. "Why do they have so many cells that are empty?" Sam asked, inspecting one of the empty cells.
"Well, it makes sense," Pete added. "This is just a reenactment. In the actual attack, there must have been more captives, so if we just..."
Pete typed a couple of buttons on his watch, causing holograms to appear in each cell. It was hard to make them out at first, but as time passed, it became more and more obvious what was going on. The holograms were replicas of the captives. "Oh, I get it," I replied, taking in the scene with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "You turned on the cinematic effect."
"Just for a second," he responded.
I looked at the replicas. If they were real replications of the captives, it was brutal. They looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. Much like the girl from our cell, it was hard to watch them. They looked so downtrodden and weak. "This is so..." Sam responded angrily, clenching his fist in a disgusted manner. "My only regret is I won't get to kick these things' butts for real." "Yeah, I hate these guys," Jaden seconded. "How could anybody do this to another creation of God?" He stared at the cell door with a fuming glare.
"These are Hanuks. They're brutes," Ariel added. "Think of a civilization of the most bloodthirsty souls you can imagine. They have the lowest percentage of saved souls in the universe. They're practically walking abominations."
Her words caught me off guard. "Man, and I thought Earth was bad," I replied as the holographs started to fade.
"Are you kidding me?" Ariel replied. "I know you guys get a bad rap in this realm, but most of it is based in jealousy. You guys overcome remarkable circumstances just to be here. Earth was the only perfect utopia ever created, the first of its kind, and you were the first of your kind. Although it is no longer the utopia it once was, it is far from bad. What Lucifer and the Fallen did to the Earth realm was the ravings of a petulant child. Those ravings sparked a temper tantrum, which led to the downfall of two of God's greatest creations. The Watchers came along after that, and it was bedlam in the Earth realm. Put up against those types of odds, God grew empathy for his creation, for you, and he gave you repentance and salvation through his highest-ranking son, Emmanuel, or Jesus as you may know him. He tried to rebuild through his chosen people, but they couldn't compete with the plague all around them. As a result, in an effort to fill you guys with his spirit, he sent his son. There had to be a sacrifice. Emmanuel was that sacrifice. He gave you the ability to do what you do. It's the Holy Spirit that separates men from the rest of God's creation. You guys have a living piece of God within you. That is as rare as gold is in this realm. It can only be obtained through the blood of the Savior and repentance of sin."
Her words resonated with me. I could tell I wasn't the only one. They took in the girl's words with a level of pride as we made our way down the corridor.
"How do you know so much about us?" Eve asked curiously.
"Her mother's a historian," Jaden responded. "It's one of the reasons we recruited her for our legion. Like her mother, Ariel has an affinity for it." She smiled as he threw his arm around her neck.
"Well, whatever the reason, thanks," Sai replied humbly. "I was beginning to believe that everybody in the heaven realm only spoke jerk."
She winced at the statement as it came out of her mouth.
"No offense, it's just nice to meet someone who, well, isn't," Sai explained, apologetically placing her hand on the girl's shoulder.
"I know they seem harsh, especially when you first get here, but they're not so bad," Jaden replied. "They may seem a little uptight, intrusive, and even bigoted, but they're not bad people, or at least they don't mean to be. They just take some getting used to. Trust me, after you've been here a couple millenniums, you don't even notice them." As he finished his sentence, the doorknob behind us jiggled violently. "Someone's coming," I let out, motioning for everyone to take cover. I looked around frantically. There wasn't a confident demeanor in the bunch. "Well, what do we do?" I replied, waiting in anticipation for the door to open.
"We have a little time," Pete replied. "Beth, do you remember what they looked like?"
"Yes," she replied timidly.
"Do you think you can match their physical look?"
Pete asked, still cautiously staring at the door with an impatiently concerned demeanor.
"I don't know. I think so," she replied remorsefully. "I can try."
"Well, don't oversell it," Eve shot, frustrated.
"I'm sorry. It's just I haven't had much practice with my morphing," she replied. "There is a lot involved. It's not like perception verts. My trait uses chemical subatomics. In order to physically copy things, I have to know their genetic makeup. Sometimes physical appearance isn't enough. I can't get an accurate read without doing a full diagnosis with my subatomic frequencer. Without that, my duplication might have the appearance to an extent, but it'll have something that a familiar eye would catch right away. In order to make a perfect match, I need an actual specimen."
She nervously gnawed at her bottom lip, cautiously looking over her shoulder.
"Well, it's the best plan we have, Beth. We have to go with it," Pete continued.
Her eyes went vacant as her powers surged. She went to one knee. Her eyes gleamed as her body began to subatomically change. It was like watching silly putty made of liquid as her body transformed. Slowly her outfit changed, then her hair, and finally her face. She was the spitting image of the guard we saw earlier. She rose to her feet, dusting herself off in an insecure manner.
"So, is this okay?"
she replied bashfully.
"It's good enough,"
Pete replied, turning to us.
"Sai, can your mind control trait work on multiple targets, or is it limited to one person at a time?"
Sai's face mimicked Beth's, showing a sign of apologetic insecurity.
"I don't know. I've never tried to use it on more than one person before," she replied. "But I don't doubt it. Anything's possible."
Pete shook his head as frustration set in.
"Well, we can't risk it,"
he continued, scratching his head as he habitually did when he was strategizing.
"Well, right now it's all we have. Beth, you'll pretend that Sai is your prisoner. Sai, once you're close enough, hit him with the mind control long enough for us to catch him off guard. Eve, you need to stay as close to these guys as possible. The rest of us will retreat back to our cells."
Eve looked at Pete as if he had lost his mind.
"I don't know how close we've grown over the past month, Pete, but my well-being is a priority to me," she barked in an aggressive whisper. "So, if you don't mind me asking, why me?"
Pete signaled for us to quiet down as the door began to move finally.
"Eve, your sound wave is the most powerful blunt force we have. You have the best chance of delivering a knockout blow," he whispered, still cautiously waiting for the door to open. "I promise, we got you. If things go bad, we'll react."
"Seriously, you don't expect us to rely on a bunch of girls, do you?" I shot, unable to pass up the chance at a dig. "Think, Evelyn. Do you think we want to lose this thing?" Auriel chuckled as Sai and Eve stared at each other cynically before forcing giggles of their own.
"Can I pause this thing and send him through a wall, please?"
Eve responded through a giggle. I gave her a confident wink that caused her to blush. Sai placed her hands around my neck, pretending to choke me, as everyone else joined in laughing at her actions.
"No time," Pete shot. "Let's get on it."
Eve gave a relenting sigh.
"Yeah," she grunted. "I'll be your guinea pig. Just hurry up."
I gave her a high five and a pat on the back. The doors slowly opened as we made our way over to the closest cage. I quickly wrestled off my jacket and tossed it over the light as I did before. Pete and Jaden took Sam and Auriel with them into a cell. I separated, taking a cell by myself.
"Beth, you and Sai go behind the far corner. Eve, use your camouflage cloak. It only lasts about 30 seconds. Remember that and pick the proper time to use it. Don't hit cloak yourself too soon. It's the only shot we got at a sneak attack,"
Pete ordered from inside the bars. "Your timing has to be nearly perfect." "Pete, seriously, you're making me nervous," she shot, wringing her hands like she was trying to wash away her bad thoughts. Pete winced, raising his hands in surrender. "Sorry, just do your best. We have you covered on this side," he replied, looking at me with a wincing smile. The three girls nodded as they worked themselves into position. Beth held Sai as Eve pressed herself against a wall. She hit a button on her uniform that caused her to vanish in a spark of light just as two guards emerged from around a corner. "So, where are we headed?" said one of them. "You heard the lieutenant. We have to get Liverman for breaking," the other replied. As they walked by my cell, something caught their attention. They paused and turned to me, and for the first time since we arrived in the base, they acted as if they could actually see me. "Why is there only one of you in here?" he asked, staring directly at me. Looking in his eyes was like looking into two ruby-red balls of fire. They were intimidating. I didn't know how to reply. I just stood speechless until he spoke again. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he replied, more agitated the second time. "Where is your cellmate?" Before I could make a sound, Beth turned the corner with Sai. Sai pretended to be tussling as Beth brought her up the aisle. "Hold still," Beth ordered. "Here is his cellmate. There must have been some type of power glitch. I was walking by the cell block and I saw her roaming around." The guards looked the two girls over suspiciously. My heart was beating fast as an awkward second of silence ensued. "What were you doing in the prisoner sector?" said one of the guards suspiciously. Beth froze like a deer in headlights. She murmured. She stuttered helplessly. It was all falling apart. I had to act before her cover was blown. I fell to my knees, covering my stomach. "Oh!" I groaned, hoping to get their attention. It worked. They turned to me for a second, inspecting me. It was just a second, but it was just enough time for Sai to do her thing. They went to question Beth again, but before they could, Sai's eyes lit up. The tension in both the men's shoulders loosened, causing their arms to drop to their sides. They were completely submissive to Sai's will. "She was just down here cleaning up your mess. She always comes down here to undermine your authority. It's something that you hate, and she has been doing it for years," Sai replied, manipulating them masterfully. They stared dumbfounded as she spoke. Her eyes dimmed as they seemed to snap out of their trance. "Never mind," one of the guards replied. "You're probably down here trying to make us look bad again." I stared at them in disbelief. It was amazing. They had no idea. Their eyes showed no recollection of what had just transpired. They were clueless. How powerful was Sai's manipulation ability if she could talk to complete strangers and turn them into mindless pawns? It was impressive, to say the least. "Well, if you did your job, I wouldn't have to," Beth added, playing along. "What did you say?" said one of the guys in an agitated voice. My heart jumped into my throat as he reached for his bludgeoning mace. Before he could reach his weapon, his partner stopped him. "She'll get hers. We just have to pick our spots. We can't be obvious, though. That's what she wants," he whispered deviously. They were vulnerable. It was the perfect time to strike. I impatiently approached the cell bars, anticipating Eve's attack. Eve let out a sound bite that caused me to recoil and cover my ears. I heard two loud groans, then two hard thuds. I turned to see the guards knocked out cold. I looked at my fingertips and saw two faint drops of blood. "Man, Eve," I whined, checking my eardrums. "Clear the collateral damage next time." As I spoke, she slowly came into view as the camouflage cloak disappeared. "I'm sorry, but like Beth and Sai, I'm just learning to use this stuff," she apologized. "Frequencies are hard to hit, especially when you're dealing with a friend and foe in the same proximity."
How'd you do that? Ariel pressed. Water uses vibration, and like most of God's creations, their brains were made up of mostly water. Using this knowledge, I sent vibrations using sound waves through the water or blood veins in their brains and caused forced hemorrhaging. I could have made their brains explode if I wanted, but that would have made for a messy scene, and I didn't want brains all over my sparkly new uniform, she boasted with a smile. Especially since I happen to love these shoes. And of course you didn't want to hurt your beautiful best friend and fellow comrades, Sai added facetiously. Eve moved her hand in a weighing motion, signifying she was impartial, causing Sai to chuckle. You know, I can't say that even occurred to me, Eve shot, scratching her chin, continuing the joke. I threw my jacket over the light and exited the cell as Pete and Jaden followed my lead. Something tells me you keep doing that to remind us you came up with it, Sai cut playfully. Yes, and it will do you well to remember that the next time you want to compare your feeble female mind to mine, Ms. Hikari, I responded smugly, pretending to fix an imaginary tie. I do this not just for you, but to let each and every one of you know I am mentally your superior. Sam and Pete burst into laughter. Sai smiled, shaking her head before picking my jacket up and forcefully jamming it into my chest. I winced playfully as she bowed, pretending to be submissive. I apologize for my ignorance, O great Timothy of Eli, she replied, shooting a bird with her extended hand. I bowed down to you and your fiercely average test scores. Hey, no need to get personal, I shot with a chuckle. But point taken. I placed my hand on her head as she playfully shoved me. I put my jacket on and made my way out of the cell and over to the passed-out guards. I reached down and started to check their pockets as the rest of the guys watched, thrown by my actions. What are you doing? Sam asked. I looked up, sighing, before turning back to the body and continuing my search. Besides further showcasing my mental superiority, I poked, staring up at Sai once more, I'm looking for a key to open that door. I would think they would have eye, finger, or DNA recognition, Eve added. I looked at her, playfully disappointed. Pete smiled, shaking his head, understanding my logic immediately. You disappoint me, my fair young pupil. Look at this place. It's medieval at best. I'll admit the liquid energy bars threw me, but it's primitive technology in comparison to the heaven realm. This is a physical realm world, I replied, finding the key in the guard's pocket. He's right. The Haniks were fairly primitive. At the time of this simulation, they didn't have enough faith energy to achieve as much as most advanced civilizations, Ariel replied, making her way over to me. The key was huge. It was the size of a wrench. I tossed it in the air and caught it with one hand before giving a flippant showman's wink. Timothy Eli, ladies and gentlemen, Sai added, causing everyone to clap as they laughed to themselves. I bowed like a showman, raising the key high above my head. That thing is huge, Sam added, following me. His ego or the key? Sai added, causing Sam to chuckle. I approached the door, looking for a keyhole. I surveyed the door with no success. It's under this thing, Eve added, picking up and moving a rusty lock cover in the shape of a lion. I guess even your superior knowledge has its holes, huh? I laughed, shoving her playfully with an accepting nod. I walked over and moved the lion out of the way. I angled the key into the right position and pushed it in. It was a little resistant at first, but finally turned. There was a cog-like sound before the door popped open. Let's go, I added, turning the corner. As we hit the hallway, there was an obvious contrast. Outside of the ruby walls that were covered in grime and soot, it looked like the barracks from an old medieval dungeon. Entering the outside halls was like stepping through a portal door into the future. It was beautiful. I guess it's safe to say they saved money at the expense of their prisoners, Eve joked as we made our way down the hall. We saw a small room to our right.
I checked the knob and signaled for everyone to follow me in. The room was completely empty outside a couple of shelves. It appeared to be a storage room. I made my way over and hid behind one of the shelves as the rest of the team followed my lead. "What are we doing?" Sam asked. "Let's go blow this place up."
"Is this kid serious?" Jaden questioned, staggered. "Unfortunately, yes," Eve added sarcastically.
"What?" Sam added, still oblivious.
"Sam, there is an army of people between us and the Central Control Center. We can't just bull rush through thousands of recruits with no powers and limited ammo," Eve explained. "This isn't whack-a-mole."
Sam nodded, as if he was taking in Eve's explanation. "Okay, I get it," Sam responded.
"He doesn't, but we'll take him no longer being combative and move forward," Sai cut dismissively.
Sam smiled uneasy and turned, trying his best to keep his facade going. It was obvious he was still oblivious. I ignored him and continued. I pulled a map holograph out of my utility pouch. It was a rod the size of a ruler with a large red button at the top. I hit the button, causing a holographic screen to extend horizontally like a scroll. It was a perfect replica of the base. It had everything mapped out, even our position. "Okay, now we're here," I instructed, pointing at the 8 green spots that illustrated our position. "Here's the center. Pete, you got any ideas?"
"Are all those red spots the hammocks?"
Sam pointed out. The board was covered in red dots. I searched the map, looking for a route, but from the look of things, it was going to take a lot of sneaking around to even get close enough to make a final push.
"Yes, you see these 2 routes. It may take some doing, but they're the 2 routes with the least resistance. We can head straight, sneaking through this hall, and hook around, hitting the corridor just behind it. Once we hit the corridor, there we'll be in the open, but I figure there is a bottleneck right here. At the entrance to the second corridor, it is extremely narrow. With Eve's sound explosion, we should be able to collapse the entrance and the bridge. The hardest part will be making our way through the first leg. For this part, I think I have a plan. I can use my ability enough to fit in one of the uniforms. Jaden and Auriel are big enough to wear costumes, and Beth, you can transform into that Liverman lady. I think we should be able to get away with one more prisoner, and since Eve is paramount to the plan, that'll have to be her. The rest will have to use the skill we uploaded. It's not going to be easy, but if we can at least get to the corridor, we might have a chance," Pete explained.
It sounded like a foolproof plan, and with Pete's track record, I had no reason to doubt him, but I was still nervous. Jaden and Auriel made their way over to the door, and with a nod, they opened the door and disappeared into the hallway. A few minutes later, they returned with every part of the Hannock's uniform on except for the helmets. Pete and Beth transformed. Pete bulged out until he was the same size as Jaden. He looked like something out of a comic book. His muscles were massive, and he was as big as a professional wrestler. "You're going to have to share your workout secret when we get out of here," I joked. Pete showcased a meek smile. He looked the same outside of the cosmetic overhaul of his body.
"Come on, sis. It's your turn," Eve prompted, patting Beth on the back.
Beth slowly transformed from the guardsman into the lady we saw when we first arrived. It was uncanny. You could tell how fluid she was becoming with every usage of her power. There was no lag like the last time. The change seemed to be smoother.
"Now, we still need one more uniform. We have to isolate someone and bring him back here. There is a pair of guardsmen just outside the door. I'm guessing there is a protocol, and it has been a couple of minutes since the last guards checked in. These 2 are probably checking up on them," Pete continued.
"So what do we do? Jump them in the jail again?" Jaden pressed.
"No, if they make it to the barracks, they may call it in," Pete replied.
"Not if we pretend we're the guards," Jaden rebutted.
"It's too risky. They may know these guys. It's smarter to jump them before they get there. That way, we can make our way back immediately," Pete replied. "Anything else would be too suspicious."
As he spoke, he covered his mouth with his finger, motioning for us to be quiet. I looked at the map, and the 2 guards were approaching. "I got this," he said, walking over to the door. "Just give me a heads up when they're just past the door." I nodded in agreement. I watched as they inched closer until I could be sure they were just beyond us, and I signaled. Pete swung open the door, pulling both men in. His power was unworldly, even without his anointing. The 2 men spilled onto the floor as Pete closed the door behind them. Boom! Pete pulverized the ground as the 2 men barrel-rolled, narrowly dodging the impact. They had cat-like quickness. They stood in their stances as they pulled out shiny red katana swords that looked like they were made of pure ruby. We all surrounded them as they maneuvered their stance to prepare for all of us. "I'm hoping this didn't go as planned, Pete," I replied, pulling my weapon from its holster. "Drop the guns or I'll shoot." The men began to whirl their swords in a masterful demonstration of their control. Swoosh! Without warning, one of them took a swing. I dodged, watching the blade narrowly miss me. As I landed on my back, I aimed and let off a flurry of shots in their direction. Ping, pang, ping! We all dove to safety as they ricocheted shots all over the room. "Great idea, Pete!" Eve screamed. "You didn't tell us they were freaking ninjas!" I looked over as we all cowered behind the shelves until the firing stopped. "They're going for help," Jaden let out, taking off. I turned to see the 2 men bolting for the door. I ran with everything I had in me to cut them off as the door swung open. I put all the force I had into my strike. Bang! Ah! The man let out. I drop-kicked the door with jarring force, smashing his hand in the process. Before he could react, I leaped to my feet and caught him with a leaping roundhouse, knocking him on his butt. "Why, you little..." grunted the other guard, taking a slash at me. I parried his swing, catching him with a hook that was about as effective as shooting him with a water gun. He stared at me with a mocking smirk before shoulder charging me into a nearby wall. "Tim!" Sai let out, charging him. Oomph! He floored her with a back kick that sent her rolling in the opposite direction. Pete charged, swinging with all his might, trying to land a knockout blow with every punch. Oomph! Oomph! Pow! The man moved like a prize fighter, peppering Pete with well-timed, accurate blows. "Ah!" Pete let out as the man stepped on his foot. Oomph! Oomph! Bang! Pete leaned forward to a forceful forearm strike that was followed by a knee to the stomach that bent him over at the waist. The assailant finished him off with an uppercut that nearly took his head off. "Why can't anything be easy?" Eve responded, still hiding behind a shelf. "Making history is messy, I guess." She turned to me, with emotion signaling that she had an idea. "Eve, don't!" I replied, trying to get to her. Before I could make a move, she had pulled 2 twin sidearms from their holsters. She gave me a wink, then dove from her cover, firing shot after shot. Bang! Bang! Pow! Bang! I watched in awe as shot after shot exploded against the blades of the guards. But this time they weren't ricocheting, they were exploding on contact. The explosion's force was so powerful it knocked the katanas from their hands. I saw an opening and I had to take it. "Pete, we have to go now," I ordered, taking off toward them. I sprinted toward the off-balance guards, with no idea how I would summon up enough power to deal a crippling enough blow. I was confident Pete could, but I was going to need help. "Tim!" Jaden screamed. "Use the wind!" His words caught me off guard. "What?" I replied, still dashing and covering as Eve's shots were still exploding. "Tim, you can't control the elements like you usually can, but Sam and Sai say you have an affinity for wind. That may mean you can use it even if you don't have your anointed power. Like your metaphysical power, it resonates with your soul," Auriel replied. Pete and I dashed toward the off-balance guards, shoulder to shoulder.
"It's worth a try,"
Pete said, cocking back to deliver his blow. What did I have to lose? I calmed myself, allowing the wind around me to move to my feet. I leaped into the air and put all the force I had into a dropkick. Boom! Pete and I struck almost simultaneously. My impact sent me flying in the opposite direction, tossing me into some nearby shelves. I covered myself as mountains of artifacts rained down on me. "That'll do," Jaden added. I tried to force myself up, but the weights of the shelves were too heavy. I squirmed for a little before I could feel their weight shifting.
"Tim, sometimes,"
Eve replied, moving the shelf with the help of the others,
"I think you let us get our butts kicked so that you can show off in the end."
"What?" I said, struggling to my feet. I staggered to my feet and stood in awe.
"Let's just say I'm glad we only needed one uniform,"
Pete replied, patting me on the shoulder. I stood staring at a gaping hole in the spot where the guard was. Did I really do that? I thought, knocking the dust off my uniform. "I guess I overdid it, huh?" I replied humbly. "Just a little," Sai poked. "Why didn't you guys tell me about this before?" I questioned, still trying to come to grips with what I had done.
"Well, we didn't know. We just figured since technically sound is an element, maybe you could use other elements as well. I deducted that sound is both a metaphysical trait and an elemental trait. But in humans, your souls dictate your metaphysical power. And when I thought about that, I remembered you have certain elements that are intertwined into your inheritance and is controlled by your soul just like a second metaphysical trait. I figured it was worth a try," Oriel replied.
"Let me guess, you're a virtue," Eve replied.
"Yes,"
Ariel replied obliviously, nodding with an exuberant smile.
"How did you know?"
"Lucky guess," Eve replied with a sarcastic smirk as Sai shook her head. "Well, it worked. Thanks, Ariel," I replied with an awkward cross between a nod and a salute. I turned to the wall, a little arrogant. I approached the hole and peeked out, surprised to see a peaceful sky. The place was surrounded by battleships before, but now it was empty. Then something occurred to me. "What about the people?" I asked, confused. "Won't they see this?" "No, it's a simulation," Jaden explained. "It can adapt to subtle change, but kicking a guy through a wall is not an anticipated scenario. It would involve reinstituting the pilot aspect and a lot of other variables that we don't have enough time to explain, but long story short, it isn't in the programming." I nodded, signaling I understood before looking over my hands and feet. I felt so helpless without my powers, but this might change the tide. This might be easier than I thought. "Pete, just hurry up and let's get this thing on the road," I demanded, brimming with confidence. Pete wrestled the uniform off the unconscious guard as we waited impatiently. He dusted off the soot and put them on. "They're a little baggy," Sai responded with a chuckle.
"Oh, okay,"
Pete said, inflating himself like a balloon.
"How's it now?"
I gave him a thumbs up as we all reconvened.
"No matter what, stick to the plan,"
Pete said cautiously. As he spoke, I noticed a large vent on the wall. I hesitated before pulling out my map again. I tapped the map, zooming in on the ventilation system, and paused for a second to take it all in. "Pete, take a look at this," I replied, calling him over. He kneeled down with the lion-style helmet still on. "Can you take that thing off?" I ordered, annoyed. "That thing gives me the creeps."
"Oh, sorry,"
Pete replied apologetically, taking the helmet off.
"So, what's up?"
"You see these vents? They run throughout the whole base," I pointed out as he nodded.
"So what, you're thinking of using them?"
he replied with an inquisitive look. "Sai, Sam, and I can use them," I replied. "It runs clear across the bridge, but it still gives us the ability to keep an eye on you guys and give you support if you run into any trouble." Pete inspected the map, nodding in agreement.
"I didn't see that. Good idea." he replied. "It has a couple of detours that'll take you out of the way and you'll temporarily lose us, but that's actually a good thing. Do you see this check-in? If you guys can take out that post center, then we should be able to stroll to the bridge with no resistance. It practically saves us the trouble of having to hit it head on, which was probably going to be the hardest part of our plan."
This is just getting embarrassing for you guys. Who's the man? Come on, Timothy, 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 I chanted, moving the map like a baton as they stared at me, unable to hold back laughter. "I'm just doing my job, people." "What job?" Eve replied. "The job of saving our butts at every turn, Ms. Tamila. Haven't you been paying attention?" I replied flippantly. "Gates me, guards me, and now I just dissected the crap out of some data." They all looked like they were considering my words. I stopped, realizing they were actually taking my act seriously. "I'm joking," I shot, laughing. "You guys really thought I was serious with that statement?" Jaden stared at me, then back at the rest of the guys. "Yeah, it kinda loses its humor when it's true," he shot, causing the rest of the guys to burst into laughter. "What?" I shot. "You guys did a lot too." "Well, I mean, we helped, but I'm definitely going to have to give the lion's share to you. I mean, you were the guy who took out half the enemy planes that opened things up for the rest of us. You were the one to think of the key to get us out of the dungeon. You took out one of the assassins that was kicking our butts, and adding this, at present, you're probably the biggest reason we've gotten this far, Tim," Sai shot, causing me to become embarrassed. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there trying to think of a rebuttal. I couldn't think of anything to say that would come off as patronizing. "Sam saved me that time," I uttered. "Pete took out the base, you guys shot people down, Jaden and Ariel gave us the opportunity to get into position to make a run." They all hesitated before nodding like they half agreed with my words. "Yeah, but come on, put it this way," Pete added. "Out of every person here, you're the one person I believe could have made it here all by yourself." I moved to speak again, but Eve cut me off. "Who cares? Do all the work, just don't brag about it," Eve shot, causing everyone to chuckle again. I smiled at the guys as she shoved me. She followed Pete and the rest of the guys to the door as they prepped their disguises. "I'll see you guys on the other side," Pete replied, turning to leave. He grabbed Eve and placed her hands behind her back. Jaden and Ariel followed suit, restraining Beth. "We're dependent on you guys. Don't let us down," Jaden replied as they disappeared out the door. We nodded as we made our way over to the vent. It was high up in the corner of the wall. I grabbed a nearby table and cautiously pushed it over, trying my best not to make any noise as I climbed to the top of it. "Sam, you think you can use your light energy to get us in?" I replied, looking down at him. "That is your elemental affinity, right?" "I don't know. It's not like faith energy. It's electricity. I can't use it like a blowtorch, especially seeing as in this place we can only do our elements at about 5% of what we can do normally. I don't know if I can do it," he replied, trying to power himself up. He was right. Whenever he tried to get a steady torch, it would just spark, then send an electric current throughout his body. I grunted, then inspected my utility pouches and backpack before I stumbled across a hunting knife. "Sai, do you think if I gave you a boost you could unscrew it?" I asked, gun-shy. She gave me a conceited grin, then leaped high over my head, ripping the vent off the wall with one hand. She landed in a playfully athletic stance, twirling the vent lid like it was weightless. "Or just pull it from the wall with massive strength. Either way," I replied flippantly. "How did you?" Sam uttered, pleasantly surprised. "Well, I figured if you guys have affinity powers, then why shouldn't we? Doms have natural physical traits, so I figured I'd give it a try. It worked. Of course, like you guys, I'm at about 5%, but it's more than enough when you're a Dom," she replied, smiling from ear to ear. "Well, this thing just got a lot easier," I replied, high-fiving her. I signaled for Sam and Sai to follow me as I hoisted myself up. Sai gave Sam a lift, then climbed in after us. It wasn't as cramped as it looked. We had to crouch, but it was so large we could walk upright inside it. "You guys just follow me," I replied, heading down the dark vent. We walked for about a minute or two before the sound of Pete's voice caught our attention. "Is that Pete?" Sai replied, placing her ear to the floor of the vent. "I can't tell," I replied, doing the same. The voices were faint, but I could still make out Pete's words. "We're taking the prisoners for questioning. This is the prisoner the lieutenant asked for, and the other we found wandering around the cell," he replied. He spoke in a gruffly lowered voice in an attempt to sound more adult. It was horrible. "Sure, just head back through security," a voice replied. "They've been waiting on you guys." "Yeah, we got caught up chasing this one around," Jaden added. "How did she get out in the first place?" the man added. "Must have been a short or something," Pete replied quickly. "Fell, go inspect the lockup. We don't need any more prisoners getting out," said a man. It was hard to follow what was going on. I wish I could have seen them. From where we were, all I could do was wonder. I couldn't tell if they were in trouble or not. "I'll head there now, sir," said another voice. "You guys need to get going as well. I'll see you there," said the man. We heard footsteps heading off in different directions. I sighed, relieved. "Man, that was close," Pete muttered. "Let's hurry. We have to secure that security check before they get there," I commanded, speeding up. We shot through the vent, maneuvering around like a mouse in a maze, until we finally came to a vent exit that looked out on the security check room. I expected it to be like a toll booth, but it was huge, and at least 100 men were in the place. Good thing Sai had regained some of her power, because we were going to need them. "So, how are we going to do this?" Sai replied, looking at me. I looked around. We had to isolate the room and make sure they couldn't call for backup. If we did that, we at least gave Pete and the rest of the guys a chance to give us a hand once they arrived. It sounded good in theory, but that was easier said than done. The place looked like a police bullpen, with workers all over the place. I scanned the scene and smiled. "We're in luck," I replied. "There are only about 20 actual guards. The rest look to be clerks and paper pushers. We just need to find a way to keep them from calling backup. We should be able to overtake this point." Sai looked at me impatiently. "So, how?" she pressed. "Yeah, how are we going to do that?" Sam added. I scooted closer to the vent and peered in. I perked up, drawing their gaze. "What is it?" Sai continued to press. "Yeah, what?" Sam pressed, seconding Sai's impatience. "Electricity," I responded. "Their whole base runs on electricity. I figure there has to be a conduit for it all. If Sam overcharges it, he'll knock out the power, and it should give us enough time to mount an offensive." Sam nodded with an unconfident demeanor. "Come on, Sam. Just like Jade taught us. It comes from inside. It's there. Just channel and send it. You don't need all your power to do it. Just like sticking a fork in a socket. All you need is one surge, and it should be enough to short out the whole building," I responded, trying to give him confidence. He nodded, signaling he would give it a try. He closed his eyes as the light began to charge through him like a static bulb. Sai and I braced ourselves as the spark grew larger. "Let it go," I replied, staring at him. He opened his eyes, and they were emissive, filled with light. He struggled to maintain his state. "What are you doing? Let it go," I continued. "That's enough to knock it off." He began to shake violently, as if it was taking everything he had to contain the power raging in his hands. "I can't," he said, taking a deep breath and powering off. I looked at Sai, confused by his actions. "What do you mean? All you had to do was release it," she replied. He shook his head. "I can't control it," he replied, confusing us even more. "It'll go crazy." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what was going on. Anger filled me as I stared at him, begging for a reason. What'll go crazy? I screamed. He looked down, shaking his head. The white flame, he replied, defeated. Sai stared at me, sensing I was about to rip into him. She raised her hand and shook her head in protest. Sam, we are not at risk here, Sai replied. Our powers are weakened. In phase 1 of this simulation, my invisibility was stagnant. Now it's useless. It's going to take a lot more than the barrier will allow for you to reach the point where that power will come out. As she spoke, her hand went in and out of visibility. She wore an empathetic smile. I don't know if I overdid it when we first arrived, she responded, or if it's this metal, but my ability to bend light at will is gone. Eve can't teleport at all. This stuff is strong. We'll be safe. Trust me. He nodded solemnly and closed his eyes. Once again, his body took on a static state. He held his hand in front of him as the electricity shot to his fingertips. Okay, he replied, struggling to maintain the light energy. Where do I shoot? I surveyed the room and pointed down. Send the light up and down this wall, I instructed, moving my hand in a wiping motion. But send a charge through the wall, not a straight shot. He nodded as sweat started to roll down his neck and face. Sai, could you take out the vent? I replied. She moved forward and slowly pulled the vent in, taking a piece of the wall with it. Hurry, Sam, I replied, rushing him. He moved forward and perched himself like a gargoyle on the cliff. He leaned back and released a steady stream of static electricity throughout the entire wall. Zap! Pop! 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 Zap! The outlets exploded, cutting the power in the entire room. The workers and security guards ran around the room, startled under the dim emergency lights. The shutters, I replied, pointing around the room. Sai, since you have your speed, you take the far side. I'll take the side to the left. They look pretty heavy, so I doubt Sam will be able to give us help in that department. But he can keep them occupied long enough to give us some time. Sam, you'll have to divert them on your own until we can get these shutters closed. Sam nodded with a smile. Finally, he replied, I can fight someone. All this thinking crap is hurting my head. I wonder if those words were ever uttered by King Solomon, Sai poked. Okay, you guys, let's go before their backup generators kick in, I urged. Sam reached in his pocket and pulled out a grappling harness and rope with a metal stud on the end. Excuse me, he responded, putting the harness on. He crouched as he spun the rope with one hand, gaining momentum with every twirl before shooting it at a wall on the opposite side of the vent. Wish me luck, he replied, securing the rope before leaping over the side. He shimmied down, bounding off the wall. It was so dark in the room that no one noticed him. As he got close enough to the ground, he released himself. Zap! He let out an electric charge that crippled two nearby officials as he came down over their heads. He quickly dove into cover, hiding underneath a nearby desk. Come on, let's hurry so we can help him, I replied, leaping onto a nearby beam that hung just in front of the vent. I felt the wind as Sai shot past me. I balanced myself before jumping to another beam, then to another. It was at least 3 stories, and it was giving me jitters that ran throughout my whole body. I tried my best not to look down as I scooted across the beam. My legs shook uneasily as I positioned myself and leaped onto the final beam. Boom! Shoom! 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 I frantically fought to balance myself at the shock of the shutters closing on the other side of the room. That was quick, I responded, speaking out loud to no one. Well, I guess that just leaves me. I leaped into the air and created a dense air pocket that extended across the massive row of shutters. Sai was right. It was so much harder to control the wind. Before, it was as easy as talking. Now, it was like I was doing a mental max out. I struggled to maintain the stubborn wind and released it at the speed of gravity. The shutters came tumbling down with crushing force. I let out as I landed hard on top of one of them. I rolled uncontrollably, bouncing on the hard steel structure, cringing each time I slammed into it. My momentum was only getting faster as I frantically reached for something to slow myself down, but the platform was smooth and there was nothing to grab onto. I reached out in a last-ditch effort as I went over. I was going too fast. My eyes grew in horror as I saw my fingertips narrowly miss the edge. I was done for. "Come on, man!" I let out, frantically reaching. "Gotcha!" I couldn't believe it. I looked up to see Sai with a grimacing look on her face. She was hanging over the edge, crouched, holding me with one hand. "If you make one joke about being saved by a girl, I'm kicking you back over," she replied, falling back as she pulled me to safety. I smiled, falling on my stomach as soon as my feet hit solid ground. We had little time to rest as the sound of converging forces caught our attention. "There! Intruders on the shutters!" I heard a voice say. "They're on the shutters!" Ping! Boom! Ping! Ping! I struggled to my feet and dove into cover as shots fired all around us. "What are we going to do?" Sai replied, shielding herself as the shots and ricocheting debris rained down on us. "Do you know any wind techniques you could use?" I leaped into action, grabbing her and pulling her body close to mine. Her face blushed as her lips stopped inches away from my neck. I was oblivious to the proximity of our bodies or how close her lips were to mine as I turned my head back around to prep her. I was too busy worrying about the bullets and debris flying all around us. Her eyes were dazed like she was in a trance as my gaze finally met hers. My mind instantly went back to Ryan's office and the haunting kiss. I felt her emotions flutter as well. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and she couldn't take her eyes off me. We both felt something in that moment that weakened both our resolves to keep up appearances. But just as quickly as we sensed it, I pulled away, snapping myself from my trance. I registered our suggestive position and moved backward with an apologizing wince. "Sorry, I needed us to be close for..." I shook off the awkward moment as she lowered her head, blushing bashfully. "Well, just watch." I ignored the butterflies and quickly explained the feelings away as jitters and awkwardness brought on by the position of our bodies. I smiled bashfully as I strengthened my grip around her. She shook her head, chuckling, still unable to meet my gaze. My heartbeat quickened as I leaped off the platform. I couldn't tell you if it was the adrenaline of the moment or the closeness of our bodies and intoxicating smell of her hair. I fought both feelings and whispered softly in her ear. "Stay as straight as possible," I replied, summoning the wind. I turned, spinning, with her body pinned against mine. The wind swirled and swirled until it became dense like the head of a power drill. The shots bounced off the dense wind, sending the bullets back the other way. "Tim!" she replied, looking down frantically. I smiled at her as she gave me a cynical glare, realizing we were no longer in danger. "And for the record, a girl didn't save me," I replied with a playful smile as we plunged downward. "My friend did." Boom! We landed hard, sending a ripple effect that left the whole area in shambles. My blow cleared the area, leaving us all alone. Once the momentum of the drop subsided, we were once again standing in a precarious position. I stepped back, guiding her away from me like she was a porcelain doll I was trying not to break. "Are you okay?" I asked, lowering my head. "Yeah, she continued, clearing her throat awkwardly in an attempt to knock herself out of her trance. Yes. Yeah, I'm fine." I felt like a heel. The mistake in Ryan's office was something I could easily write off, but this was different. I fought it with everything in me, but something was drawing me to Sai, and I hated that feeling. It felt like a betrayal to Pete. That mindset caused me to pull away. Sai noticed my demeanor as I released her hands, abruptly backing away. She grimaced angrily. "Why do you do that?" she asked, holding no punches. "You always do that." I stared at her, confused by her phrasing. "Do what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She shook her head and let out an exhausted sigh. "Nothing, Tim," she replied, throwing her hands in the air in frustration. "No, it's obviously something," I pressed. "What did you mean by that?" She placed her head in her hand before meeting my gaze. "Why do you fight what you feel all the time?" Sai uttered. "Nobody's here, Tim. It's just me and you. Why are you fighting?" She stopped, catching herself before shots rang out, startling us both. We were both so caught up in our conversation, we blocked out the mayhem and gunfire going on across the room. I shrugged, unable to grasp the meaning behind her words. "I'm not," I sputtered. "I mean, what are you talking about? I'm not fighting any feelings, Sai." She stared at me like I was hopeless before grabbing her sidearms from their holsters and brushing past me angrily. I moved to press her on her words. I turned just in time to see a group of guards storming towards us. "Well, it's safe to say they know we're here," Sai replied, pulling me as shots rang out again. We crawled away, shielding ourselves behind a large piece of debris. "This was not one of my best plans," I replied, shielding myself. Sai stared at me like she wanted to knock me into next week. "I guess that's safe to say," she replied, taking cover. "Where's Sam?" A blue light of electricity shot through the entire area. It was like a cold heat, sending a shiver up my spine that paralyzed me on contact. I convulsed violently, trying to gain control of my motor skills. The shock had thrown my entire nervous system out of whack. When I tried to move my feet, my eye would blink, and when I tried to sit up, I crinkled my toes. It was the worst feeling I had ever felt. "Tim," Sai replied, running to my side. I couldn't move, and I felt like a prisoner in my own body. I stared at Sai, vacantly trying to speak, but nothing came out. "I got him." I couldn't turn my head, but I could tell it was Sam. Slowly, I felt a warm sensation move through my body as I gained control of my body limb by limb. I moved my jaw from side to side and stared at my fingers, moving them in an exhibition. "What in the world was that?" I replied, trying to get my bearings. Sam smiled and saluted with a tilt of his head. "Cool, huh?" he replied. "Jade taught me that. Electricity controls the body's nervous system. So, as elementals, we control the body's nervous system. Maybe not to the extent of a vert, but we have our tricks." I turned to Sai, confused. "Why didn't it affect you?" I questioned, still moving my limbs as if I was going through rigor mortis. She smiled and shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know," she replied. "It just didn't. Maybe it's because of our ability to control such dense light energy. Maybe it makes our immunity and nervous system stronger." She looked at Sam for confirmation. "Don't look at me," he replied, shrugging his shoulders. "I have a hard enough time with the basics. I just know how to do it. And judging by the way I just deep-fried Tim, I barely know that." I nodded, looking at the carnage. The room was covered in sizzling bodies convulsing all over the place. It was amazing. Based on the things we had been doing since we arrived, it was fairly common, but Sam wasn't like the rest of us. We were all products of Angel Haven. Our intelligence was beyond that of normal kids our age, but Sam wasn't. The technique was extremely complicated. "Sam, how did you do that?" I replied, still looking around in awe. "What do you mean? It's like I said, Jade taught me," he replied, staring at Sai with a sarcastic smirk. She cut her eyes, shaking her head, ignoring his actions. "No, this technique took control. It dealt with frequencies, elemental composition, transdimensional calculations. I replied, surprised. I never knew you. I mean, you're a lot smarter than you lead on. He shrugged his shoulder, helping me to my feet. Maybe it was like Sai said. Maybe we were rubbing off on him. Well, what can I say? Sometimes it pays to be a nerd, he replied, knocking the dirt off his uniform. We made our way over to the check-in window, making sure to stay hidden. The place was an absolute mess. Why isn't this place being flooded with troops? Sam wondered out loud. I mean, we were really loud. I crept over to the window and peered out. Jaden said this place has certain frequencies it can't account for, because at the time all this happened, certain things were impossible, I explained, looking frantically for Pete and the rest of the guys. So I figured this would fall under that title. He and Sai nodded, signaling they understood as Pete and the rest of the gang came into view. They looked around frantically, making their way to the checkpoint cautiously. I waved my hand, signaling for them to hurry. They sped up their march to a trot. Sai, if you would, I replied, signaling for her help with the shutters. She walked over to one, and with little more than a sighing strain, she lifted it, allowing the others to pile in. All right, Pete replied, pulling off the armor and powering back down. He dropped to one knee, wheezing as he shrinked back to his original size. Beth mimicked him, collapsing on the floor next to him as she slowly morphed back to her normal body. Are you guys all right? I questioned, coming over to help them out. Beth sat up as Eve cuddled her like a mother treating her child. I gave Pete a leaning shoulder as he used me to stand up straight. Yeah, we're fine. It's just this place. When I transform, I can't sustain it. It's like holding my breath. We had to keep stopping so that Beth and I could recharge, he replied, still taking deep breaths between every word he spoke. It got real dicey a couple of times. He tossed the heavy armor to the floor, causing a loud thud to echo throughout the newly vacant room. What in the world happened here? Eve replied, looking around amazed. I smiled as I grabbed Sam and Sai under each arm. We did our job? I replied with a sarcastic smirk. Sai shrugged, hugging me back, feeling a bit embarrassed after our previous exchange. I felt just as awkward, but I figured trying to force my feelings of confused infatuation into a logical outlet was my healthiest course of action. Ariel walked over to one of the bodies. She inched over cautiously and touched one of them, before recoiling and fanning her hand in the wind as if she was trying to put out an invisible fire. Man, that's hot, she replied in agony. How did you guys do this? I smiled and pointed at Sam. Sam, you did this? Eve replied, amazed. How did you? I didn't even... I'm really starting to think you guys think I'm a complete idiot, Sam replied, tongue-in-cheek. The fact that you're still debating that isn't helping your argument, Eve replied, playfully bopping him on the head. In the meantime, though, good job. He smiled as we loaded up and prepared to embark on the last leg of our attacking on the base. We had to move if we had any chance of annihilating that bridge before they found us out. Let's go, I replied, making my way over to the shutter. Hold on a second, Pete replied, stopping me. You guys, this is going to be a straight shot. We won't have any room for error. As soon as we exit this room, we're going to have to book it. We all nodded as Sai forced the shutter open. The place was swarming both behind the check-in and in front of it. Luckily, no one approached the check-in, or we were done for. On the count of 3, I ordered. 1, 2, 3. I darted from around the corner with the rest of our ragtag team close behind. Intruders! The prisoners are free! Sound the alarm! Ordered one of the guards hysterically. Seconds later, an alarm exploded, sending me into overdrive. My senses were going crazy. I felt nauseous. It was a wonder I was able to maintain my sprint in my state. There's the tunnel, Eve pointed, hot on my tail. The shots ricocheted off the tunnel wall as we sprinted into it. I ducked for cover, using my wind to create a barrier. But with all the energy I was using to run, it was nowhere near dense enough to block the shots. But it did divert the bullets away from where the guards were aiming. "We're almost there," I exclaimed, inching closer and closer to our goal. I heard a familiar scream that stopped me in my tracks. It was Eve. She had been shot. She dropped and barrel rolled behind a pillar as the rest of the team continued to sprint, unaware of her predicament. "Eve!" I replied, moving to the side as the rest of the guys whizzed by me. She cowered as chunks exploded against the pillar she hid behind. From the sound of her scream, it was obvious she had been wounded. She looked like she couldn't take another step as she shielded herself helplessly. She wasn't going to make it. I used my wind as a shield, causing the bullets to fly in opposite directions as I made my way back to her. "Tim, what are you doing?" Sam asked, stopping next to me. "It's Eve. She's been hit," I replied, making my way back to her. "Go ahead. I'll meet you guys once I have her." "No way I'm going with," Sam managed to utter, before I sent a gust of wind that sent he and the rest of the team flying forward. Whoosh! The push was just enough to clear the bridge. "Tim, just go. I'll be all right. It's just a game," she replied, curled into a tiny ball as light bounced off the wall and ground all around her. I sprinted over and used a dense wind bubble to cover us. She stared into my eyes with admiration as I pressed her body against mine in the same manner I had done with Sai moments earlier. I pulled her into my arms as she lowered her head bashfully. "That doesn't matter," I replied. "This is a chance for us to gain experience in a situation like this. And the fact that I can't die gives me more of a reason to turn around, not keep going and leave a friend behind." She forced herself to look at me. I smiled, lovingly cradling her as shots rang out all around us. "Besides, I got this," I replied, shifting the weight of the balloon. "Hold on to me." I flexed, straining as the wind shifted to our backs. The guards were gaining ground fast. We had to move quickly, and I had an idea. I let the wind build up force until it literally started to burrow into the solid ground. Then all at once, I let it go. The momentum of the wind sent me and Eve spiraling toward the rest of the team. They stood watching before narrowly diving out of the way as we came screaming across the other side of the bridge. I landed, turning my body to shield Eve as we slid across the hard surface. We slowed as we landed with her body on top of mine. I grimaced as Eve paused, taking in the moment. I awkwardly stared in her eyes, not wanting to move her. "Eve?" I replied, trying to snap her out of her trance. She sputtered, then quickly rolled off of me, embarrassed by her actions. "Sorry," she muttered. "It's fine," I responded. "How's your wound?" "I've been better," she replied, wincing in obvious pain. "Pete, can you fix her?" I replied, hoping he was able to use his power. I grabbed Eve and rolled to safety as chunks of debris came spiraling at us. The cavalry had come to greet us. "They closed in sooner than I figured they would," Pete replied as shots pinged in front of us and behind us. "We have to take out that bridge, now!" He reached out with one arm. Eve jerked as a piece of scrap metal came out of her shoulder. I watched as her body seemed to be fixing herself. She rose to her feet, moving her shoulder forward and backward, pleasantly surprised. "How did you do that?" she replied. "I thought you said you couldn't use time manipulation in this place." I turned to Pete with a puzzled look as he crawled into cover. "Time manipulation?" I questioned. "I thought that was your healing ability." He shook his head as he shielded himself from the incoming fire. "No, I can't use my healing here," he replied, still covering as he spoke. "I could barely use my time manipulation ability.
but I figured if I continued to stock my faith energy, I could exert enough of it to use it accurately. It wasn't easy, but if I hone in on an event, for instance, Eve getting shot, I don't have the power to stop time with the command that I normally do, but I can reverse the happening of an isolated event like the shot. So I reversed time, isolating that particular incident, making it so the shot never happened. It wasn't easy, and I've been stocking my faith energy since we arrived on a whim. I hoped I could use the little I had. It never hurts to have an ace in the hole.
Boom! I shielded myself as a chunk of wall narrowly missed my face. We were running out of time. Our cover was getting smaller and smaller by the minute. Eve, I replied, signaling for her to do her thing.
Okay, but you're going to have to give me some room, she replied. Go on the other side with the others. Hurry!
I nodded, pressing my back up against the wall. I took a deep breath and peeked around the corner, waiting for an opening. When one finally presented itself, I barrel rolled to the other side with the rest of the team. Cover your ears, and make sure your fingers are so deep that you can't hear a thing, she replied, motioning with her fingers. We all followed her instructions, giving the okay when we thought we were ready. She gave a nod, then walked over to the entrance, still making sure she was shielded from the shots coming from all sides. She let out a howl that was so dense it was visible. It was a beautiful, soft navy blue wave that seemed to meld with the wind. As beautiful and soft as her light energy appeared, there was nothing soft about the power of it. It was devastating. We watched in awe as the solid structure came crumbling down. Her power was unreal. She sprinted to our side as the last part of the bridge crashed. Good job, Eve, I replied, congratulating her with a pat on the back. She bent over, still recovering from her massive show of power. It had taken its toll.
We have to go, now, Pete ordered. That sound wave had to take out anything within its radius. We should be able to mount a push toward the console.
He shot around the corner, pulling out his sidearm and sprinting into action. Pete, Sai moved, reaching to grab him. She was too late. She sighed, turning to us with a relenting glare. I shrugged my shoulders and returned her look with an exhausted glare of my own. Why should things be any easier now? I replied, pulling out my guns and sprinting after him. I turned to see Pete maneuvering through the mangled bodies left in the wake of Eve's attack. I sprinted to catch up with him, stepping through and around them. She had taken out the entire guard. Bodies were everywhere. Remind me to stay on your good side, I replied, turning to her.
Tim, let's not set unobtainable goals, she replied with a smile. I'm no fortune teller, but this is tame compared to what will happen if we leave that in your hands.
The rest of the guys chuckled as we came to a fork in the road.
The console is straight ahead, Pete replied, gleaming. We're going to actually do this, Jaden let out, excited.
Seems like it, Sai replied. We sprinted down the corridor and noticed that everyone in the control room had felt the effects of Eve's assault.
I have met many sound users in my time as a recruit, Ariel replied. But this, it's unreal. How could an attack working at about 5% be this powerful?
We all stood staring at the carnage, unable to wrap our heads around it ourselves. It was ridiculous. I know you've heard this since you guys were brought together, but I've never seen an Earthborn. Forget that. Any Legion with this type of potential, Jaden replied, staring at the bodies. I know teams who have been training for centuries who can't do half of the things you guys are doing. Pete walked over to the console and began to punch in the coordinates. He stared at us, then back at it as he finished.
That's it, Pete replied, stepping back. That should be the end.
Well, this was a jib, Sam added, surveying things.
Yeah, I replied. I was expecting it to be a little more grandiose.
Crew! As I spoke, the room began to change. The walls began to fidget like a television channel trying to get a reception before a holograph of Ethan Dunst appeared. It walked across the floor, surveying the layout before turning to us. "I walked these halls willing to sacrifice everything I had for my planet, my family, and my comrades," he replied, shaking his head solemnly. "But God was never my focus. So, I killed myself, hoping that I would have the opportunity to die a warrior's death, and I succeeded. But what lay on the other side wasn't the warrior's welcome I was always told would be waiting for me by my radical religious leaders." As he finished his sentence, raging flames erupted all around us. We cowered as the heat from the flames nipped at our necks. Mangled bodies of people adorned the walls of this pit. I was beside myself with panic and fear. I shielded the rest of the team as a large minotaur appeared out of nowhere across the room. What greeted me was a rioting, depressing cesspool of evil. I could smell the rotting flesh, but as I neared the hellish prison, the words of my sister comforted me. She stated that through the power of Jesus Christ I'd be saved. She stated that his sacrifice for the beings of the fable realm of Earth gave everyone in the universe redemption. I ignored her that day. I took her words as mere ramblings of a weak human being who was too cowardly to take up the sword and die for Zeus as I did. But now her words were my only hope and redemption. So I said the prayers she sent to me every week, hoping that one day I'd say it. Those words filled me with anointment, and I took on the sin I had fostered. That sin was wrath. As he spoke, he pointed toward the Minotaur. "This should be a small feat for prospects like you, but for me, without the powers I now possess, it was far from that," he responded, dispersing. I sighed, staring at the humongous monster, unable to fathom how we were going to take it down without our powers. "Is this grandiose enough for you two?" Eve cut, shaking her head in frustration. Boom! The monster lunged forward, slamming his fist into the ground as we narrowly dodged the attack. "Well, we tried," she continued, pulling her sidearm out. "But clearly this game will be over soon." "Pete, please tell me you have a plan," I let out, aiming my guns as it crept closer to us. He looked at me with an agitated glance. "What am I, a computer?" he replied. "How can I have a plan already?" Whoosh! Boom! The monster took another swing before leaping in the air and coming down hard with an axe handle barrage as we ducked and dodged for our life. Pop! Pow! Pop! Pop! I let out shots in his direction, but they bounced off him like they were made of rubber. "Well, this is useless," I replied, tossing the guns to the side. Wham! Before I could react, Sai leveled the monster with a powerful right hook. Zap! Sam let out an electrical current that caused the monster to scream out in pain. "Keep it up, you guys," Pete ordered. "I think I have an idea." Whoosh! I summoned up all the wind I could muster. "Element Delta, wind command, slicing wind," I replied, letting off one of the few attacks I could manage. Thip, whip, thip, whip. The beast let out a blood-curdling cry as the wind sliced into him. Eve let out sound-aided shots from her sidearm that knocked him off balance. He groaned, punching the ground, sending a large boulder in her direction. "Eve, watch out!" I warned, knocking her out of the way just in the nick of time. Boom! Roar! The demon let out, punching the ground right in front of us. I backpedaled, shielding Eve as it inched toward us. "Is there a surrender button on this thing?" Eve replied, rushing to her feet. The beast let out, inches away from our faces. "I don't know, but if there was, I doubt he'd be the one to tell us," I replied, shielding her. "I'll take your word for it," she replied, aiming her guns from behind me. Eve, I replied as the two barrels appeared over my shoulders. Maybe we should... She fired 2 point-blank shots, knocking the beast back, forcing it to cover its face. It let out once again. I think you made it angrier, I replied, readying myself for an attack. Boom! We both dived in opposite directions as he took another swing. Tim! Sai screamed, leaping into action to protect us. Wham! Wham! Oof! She let loose with a barrage of punches that sent the beast sprawling across the floor. Boom! I struggled to balance myself as the ground trembled around us. It was Jaden. He sent an earth-shattering earthquake that engulfed the beast and trapped him in the surrounding stone. The only thing that remained above ground was the beast's upper body. It screamed, fighting to free itself. Elemental? Sam let out, noticing. Jaden smiled confidently. He stomped hard, causing a chunk of the ground the size of a car to sail high in the air, catching it with one hand. He bounced it like a pebble and fired it like a pitcher from the mound. Boom! The rock nearly took the thing's head off. We all cheered as the monster disappeared behind tons of rock. I dropped to my knee to catch my breath, sure the worst was over. Thanks, Jaden, I uttered, out of breath. That thing was like hitting rock. Ah! It grunted, causing me to lower my head in frustration. Are you serious? I shot, turning toward the demon as it tossed boulders to the side and charged us angrily without a scratch on it. We're hitting him with everything we've got, Eve replied, letting out more rounds. But none of it is having a lasting effect. At this rate, we'll become exhausted before we do any real damage to it. She was right. No matter how hard we hit the thing, it just continued to attack. Where's Pete? I replied, searching for him. It leaped forward, smashing into the ground with another barrage as we narrowly escaped, dodging in different directions. I moved to attack, but before I could, a light blue blur whizzed by me. Sai, wait! I ordered, unable to grab her in time. Oof! Wham! Ugh! She attacked with a front drop kick that sent the beast off balance. She followed the kick with 2 swaying haymakers, but it was futile. I could see she wouldn't be able to block a counter. She was banking on her punches having a deeper effect than they did. She didn't account for her drop in power. The monster absorbed the glancing blows before grabbing Sai's entire body with one hand. Sai! Pete and I seemed to shriek immediately. Crush! The beast squeezed until I heard a crack so loud it made me jerk in a wincing manner. I watched in horror as the mindless beast tossed Sai's lifeless body into a nearby heap of rubble. My heart sank at the sight. The sight was like something out of my worst nightmare. I couldn't process any emotion but a deep anger that surged forward like a bursting volcano. Everything seemed to move in slow motion after that. I stood staring at the scene for a second as Sai's body lay lifeless on the ground. Sai! I let out, turning to the beast angrily. The beast cried, staring me down almost as if to be taunting me. My blood boiled. I felt no fear as I darted for the beast. Only I felt was a need for carnage and retribution. From that moment I saw Sai's body, a switch seemed to click in my mind. My muscles and senses seemed to go into overdrive. Tim, you can't, Eve uttered before stopping at my explosion in power. Shh! I covered myself with wind and light energy as rage filled me. You dumb pile of... I replied, charging him head on. It let out, cocking back to hit me. It swung with everything it had, but he was too slow, and I was a bit berserk. How did he do that? Ariel replied, watching in amazement. Wham! Bam! Bam! Wham! My wind-aided punches landed flush. His attack on Sai repeated in my head as I hit him with punch after punch. I was seething with anger as I flipped high in the air. I mimicked my earlier routine as the wind swirled into a dense, hammer-like state. This isn't a hard thing to grasp, but I know you're too stupid to get it, I replied, hovering as the beast fought to recover from my attack. This isn't for you. This is for anybody who may be listening or watching this with malintent. Hear me, and hear me good. Even if you ignore everything that comes out of my mouth, don't miss this. Take it and tattoo it in your brain. If any of you filthy waste of light energies are dumb enough to harm one of my friends, you'll have to deal with me. And my aim is to destroy anybody stupid enough to test that part of who I am. The rest of the Legion looked at me, not knowing whether to be impressed or afraid. They cowered as my power surged, emitting a light that was so dense they could feel it in the wind that was nearly knocking them over. Tim! Eve screamed, fighting to remain standing as my power raged. Tone it down! You're about to take us out too! Roar! The beast cried angrily in my direction. I plunged feet first with reckless abandon. Kaboom! The force was crushing. It was so powerful it sent my friends and comrades flying in opposite directions as well. They peeled themselves off the ground, staring at the dust and debris that surround the spot where I plunged. Did he? Ariel uttered, trying to get a good look through the dust cloud. When the dust settled, I stood on the beast's chest, holding it by its neck as the rest of the team looked at me like I was from another planet. There's no way, Jaden replied, staring at me in awe. How is he doing that? The beast cried again, trying to break free. I held him in place with one hand like he was nothing. My powers had somehow superseded the simulation. My eyes were so bright, I could actually see them shining off the beast's face. A sadistic grin covered my face. The power was intoxicating, and I was drunk with it. Shut up, I replied. I landed a punch that literally left a hole the size of a small crater behind the demon's head. My Legion mates inched closer cautiously. They weren't sure if I was still in control. Eve approached with her hands raised in submission. Tim, is that you? She let out, gun-shy, as she pointed at me with a flabbergasted demeanor. Your hair. Light is in your hair. How can light be in your hair? I looked myself over. I could see my veins and muscles pumping light throughout my body. The constant flow of light made me look like I was tattooed from head to toe. Sigh, I replied, remembering her. I flash-stepped to her side as she pulled herself upright. Are you okay? I asked, kneeling at her side. Outside of a broken shoulder, collarbone, couple of broken ribs, and bleeding internally, I'll be fine, she replied with a smile. Nice look, by the way. I returned her smile, moving a strand of her hair from her face. Her pain had to be unbearable. She balanced herself on one arm as she fought to breathe. I brought her body into mine, squeezing her as if I could purge the pain from her. I knew it was a game, but the thought of losing her was crippling. I placed my forehead on hers before kissing the top of her head in a cherishing manner. We're going to get you out of here, okay? I replied, resting her back on the bare floor. I removed my jacket and placed it under her head as she fought to remain conscious as the pain tore through her. Eve! I shot, motioning for her to come over. Eve immediately followed my orders, dashing over to us. Make sure she's comfortable, I replied, turning back toward the monster as she nodded, staring at her best friend sympathetically. Destroy that overgrown waste of life, she shot angrily, staring at Sai's broken body. She turned to me, showcasing small bits of energy shooting through her as well. She was seething with anger and vitriol. With pleasure, I shot, turning to the beast. It fought to its feet, shaking its head like it was trying to clear the cobwebs out from my last attack. It seemed madder than ever as it zoomed in on me, charging in my direction full speed.
"Tim,"
said a voice. I turned to see Pete running toward me.
"Time for Psy,"
he said, tossing me a trident-like pitchfork as he ran to Eve's side.
"It's the one thing that can kill him. It's made of faith energy. It's the only light in the dark, and it's in a place where you'd least expect it. It's how Dunce beat it. Trust me."
I caught it with one hand, spinning it and slamming the handle of it into the ground. I could have made it quick, but I didn't want to. I wanted to make the beast suffer for what he did to Psy. Dodge! Stab! I waited on the beast to try to strike. I dodged underneath it, lodging the weapon into its arm, causing it to shriek in pain. Spin! Stab! I dislodged the weapon, then lodged it into the beast's opposite leg, causing it to collapse as the rest of the guys stared at me, unable to quantify what they were seeing. Like I said, don't ever mess with one of my friends, I shot angrily, dislodging the weapon and spinning it in a helicopter motion. Stab! I slowed the spin, then lodged the trident deep into the beast's head, causing it to topple over and gurgled out in pain. He trembled violently before collapsing in on himself in an explosion. Eve and Pete recoiled, covering Psy as the explosion let out.
"Oh my,"
Oriel shot, covering her mouth in complete astonishment.
"These guys are unreal."
When the dust settled, the room began to morph again. A holograph of the Minotaur and Evan Dunst appeared. We stood watching as the battle between he and the Minotaur played out right in front of us. "Is this really what happened?" Sam replied, walking up to the hologram. The Minotaur hit him with a blow that sent him sprawling across the floor. He crawled helplessly, trying to get away from the hideous beast. We watched in horror as the beast lunged forward, ready to pounce. I went to shield my eyes as it came down, unable to watch what I was sure was an execution, but to my surprise, the beast hung lifelessly, bent over at the waist. A moment passed before the beast doubled over next to Dunst. He had impaled the beast with the exact pitchfork Pete had tossed to me. He rolled over, exhausted. He stared around the place frantically before letting out a blood-curdling cry. He was breaking down in front of us. He fell to his knees in a relenting manner and began to say the Lord's Prayer. As he did, a light shot through the sea of bodies and locked onto him. He hovered for a second, then disappeared into the light. As he did, the room changed once more. "Awesome," Sam let out.
"Finally," I said, sighing. "Good. I don't think Psy can hold out much longer," Eve let out.
We all stood on the opposite side of the ride we had entered what seemed like an eternity ago. Our clothing had returned to normal, but I was surprised to see my wounds were still there. I couldn't understand it. The ride was over. Why wasn't I healed? I shuddered as my brain put together the scenario. If I wasn't healed, then neither was Psy. Psy doubled over, catching all our attention. "Psy," I replied, rushing to her side. What was going on? I thought for sure that the effects of the simulation would wear off once the simulation was done, but Psy's injuries looked exactly the same. It was finally starting to hit me. It wasn't a simulation at all. It was a portal door to some alternate reality.
"I'll be fine,"
she replied, blood starting to seep from her mouth.
"Once my powers kick in. Well, actually, now that I think about it, that won't do me much good, seeing as I don't regenerate."
"Sis!" I heard a voice ring out. I turned to see Luke sprinting around the corner with panic written all over his face. Jacob, Uriah, and Danielle were right behind him.
Luke,
she replied, slipping into unconsciousness. Her body lay up against a nearby wall. Her head swayed from left to right as if she was physically fighting to stay conscious. I removed my jacket and covered her body in a remedial effort to stop the bleeding. "Sai, I'm so sorry," I replied, leaning forward, wiping the blood from her mouth with a cloth I had in my pocket.
"Tim, how in the world is this your fault? You have nothing to be sorry about,"
she replied, looking me in the eye.
"I made the decision."
"Of course," I replied, taken aback.
"I didn't do anything you wouldn't have. I was protecting my friends. It was my decision. I did it for my legion and my allies. Tim, please don't be mad at yourself because I made that decision,"
she muttered, struggling to get every word out that she could.
"Just thank me, idiot."
"Thanks," I uttered, wiping her mouth. She stared into my eyes, taking in the concern and worry on my face. I stuttered, as confused as she smiled.
"At least for once I can see you care,"
she replied faintly, as her head slumped to the side. As she finished her sentence, she fell into an unconscious state. I clenched her hand, acknowledging her words with a deep level of sadness. I pulled a strand of her hair out of her face without thinking. "I got you, little sis," Luke replied, dropping to her side. Jacob flash-stepped in front of him, blocking his access to her body. "Don't move her," he ordered. "The paramedics are on the way." Just as he spoke, a group of androids dressed in hotel staff uniforms with medical badges on them came rushing around the corner. I slowly moved out of the way as they assisted her. They covered her with a white light that lasted a couple of seconds, then disappeared. When it vanished, Sai was gone, along with it.
"Where did she go?"
Pete asked with a concerned demeanor. "We transported her to Eden Hotel's med unit," the android replied. He mashed buttons on a pad as he spoke. I looked down at the blood on my shirt, gripping it in anger.
"So, will she be all right?"
Eve asked. The man stared peripherally at her, as if to be inspecting who she was for the first time before responding. "If she had her heaven realm body, she would be fine in a couple of hours, but seeing as she still has her earthborn body, it'll take a couple of days before she is even conscious. She's a Dom, so her body will adapt and evolve quickly, but for the time being, we don't know when she'll come around," he replied with an emotionless demeanor. I stared at him, thrown both by his demeanor and his response. How could they put such a dangerous ride in a celebration the night before the competition? It was insane.
"Wait, are you saying that we could have just lost one of our top Legion mates before the Light Guard trials even began?"
Pete replied rhetorically. The man looked up from the pad for a second, nodding. His demeanor was really starting to irk me. I stared at him angrily, trying my best to remember he was just an android. "Well, yes, that is a possibility. These rides have warnings on each of them," he replied, pointing to an angelic sign that was posted at the entrance to the ride. "Although, like I stated, normally it isn't that big of a risk with a heaven realm body, but considering the fact that you guys went on a ride that is widely considered the hardest simulation in the entire celebration, combine that with the fact that you're still using your earthborn bodies, you guys took on a far greater risk. Didn't you read the sign before you went in?" His words were robotic and cold, which gave them an insensitive and condescending feel. "No, we can't read angelic," Eve replied, fuming. "Oh, well, that makes more sense," he replied, shrugging his shoulders as he walked around the corner. Jacob stared off in space, as if to be controlling his emotion. "What were you guys thinking?" he lashed out. "How could you get on a ride without knowing what it is?" They all looked around, embarrassed. I ignored him. The last thing I wanted to hear at that time was belly aching from Jacob. All I could think about was Sai. I stared at the blood-soaked cloth, fighting back feelings of guilt. The least I could do was honor Sai's words and not blame myself, but at the time it was hard for me. "We didn't know," Eve fired back. Luke cut his eyes at the explanation. I rarely saw him angry. He was always so laid back. I had always known how protective he was of Sai, but now it was on display. It wasn't like him to criticize anyone, but he wanted answers. I understood why. He was angry because nothing we did made sense. "That's the point. You didn't know," Luke replied. Eve jerked back, taking offense to his protest. She seemed almost hurt at the sound of his words. "Luke, come on. You've got to admit it's not something we're used to. Seriously, who thinks they could have something that dangerous at a celebration?" she fired. "Eve, these are the most powerful trial legions in existence. A 90-degree drop doesn't exactly do the trick. A top-secret mission seems par for the course to me if you're talking fear, adrenaline, and excitement. It's exactly what I'd expect," Uriah added. "Sai did say something to that effect earlier," Pete replied solemnly. "Even without that, didn't you guys notice how empty it was in here?" Danielle replied, spinning around as if to be showcasing our surroundings. "I mean, hello?" "We just went to the first ride we saw," Sam added apologetically. "Well, great job. Now my sister is laid up because of it," Luke lashed out, punching a nearby wall so hard it toppled in on itself. He stormed around the corner, seething. Jacob stood, shaking his head, disappointed, before running behind him. Uriah and Danielle followed soon after. "Tim, you okay?" Eve replied, concerned. I was so out of it that I didn't hear her. I wanted out. From the moment Sai disappeared, I was vacant. All I wanted to do was see her again. "Tim?" Eve continued. I turned to her with my eyes still glazed over before responding. "No," I replied, rising to my feet. She moved to place her hand on my shoulder to comfort me. I was so out of it that I walked past her like she wasn't there. She dropped her head empathetically. "How does that even happen? I mean, we're in heaven," Sam replied, confused. "It doesn't work like that," Ariel added, surprised by Sam's response. "All life, no matter what realm it dwells in, comes from Father Yahweh. Whether they're heaven realm bodies or earth realm bodies, they're nothing but houses for the soul. The only difference is a heaven realm body is a permanent house, while an earth realm body is temporary. If the physical drama is severe enough, your bodies can disconnect from your soul. The drama Sai took from the Minotaur would have permanently disconnected her soul from her body if she would have been in the earth realm. That's what dying is, but since she's in the heaven realm, her soul has to wait until its vessel is repaired before it can re-enter it." "Theta! Delta! Theta! Delta! Theta! Delta!" "What the?" Sam wondered aloud. "What are they doing? What is that?" A loud cheer emanated just outside the exit of the simulation. Through all the commotion, I forgot we made history. The cheering made me put things in context. What was with these people? What were we doing? What was happening to us? I thought as the cheering continued. "It's the legions that fought in the simulation with us," Jaden replied, amused. "Undoubtedly, the media is on hand as well. It's a pretty big deal to break one of these records at the Light Guard Trials celebration. It's unheard of for a legion to conquer the hardest simulation in the celebration." I was in no mood. I didn't even flinch at the sound of his words. I grabbed my blood-soaked jacket and tossed it over my shoulder. I refused to take part in the act any longer. "I'll catch up with you guys later," I replied solemnly. "I can't do this knowing Sai's out of it." Eve stared at me for a second, as if to be checking my motives before following my lead. "Yeah, we'll go with you," she replied, volunteering. "Jaden, you and Ariel can go ahead." "Are you guys serious?" Jaden replied. "I mean, it's not the Earthborn realm. She'll be all right." This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Not just the record, but the celebration in general. At that moment, the last thing on my mind was getting more accolades for essentially doing nothing, especially when those accolades came at the expense of my best friend. I headed toward the entrance in an attempt to avoid the commotion that was sure to be waiting for us behind the exit door. Eve and the rest of the guys quickly grabbed their things and followed me.
We understand that, but it doesn't seem right to celebrate without Sai, Eve replied courteously. I guess it's an Earthborn thing. It was nice meeting you guys, and good luck in the trials. Yeah, you guys are pretty cool, Pete seconded. Good luck.
We'll see you around the hotel, Sam added. He and Ariel gave nods in our directions as we exited. They looked utterly flabbergasted by our actions. I took a second to wave goodbye as we disappeared around the corner. The ride was relatively empty outside a couple of stragglers. Dude, that's them, said one of them. His words seemed to catch the attention of everyone in line as they pointed in our direction.
They beat the Hannock simulation, said another. Are you serious? When did they beat it? Said another one.
I threw on my jacket and covered my head with my hood as the others followed suit. But by this point, the commotion had attracted the media cameras. They converged on us as we exited the simulation. How does it feel to break such a prestigious record? I lowered my head, staring forward, shielding myself from the microphone. I wore an angry snarl as they pivoted in front of us. We maneuvered as the crowd got thicker and thicker around us, with the reporters leading the mob.
No comment, Eve replied. Yes, if you guys could please be courteous to our situation, Pete added.
The reporters ignored their plea, continuing to fire questions. I became more and more aggressive in my maneuvering, using elbows and forearms more adamantly to pave my way. Mr. Eli, what power you showed to overcome the anti-anointing metals? How was that possible? I looked at the camera as rage shot through me. Somehow my energy had lashed out, causing all the orb-like camcorders to explode. The crowd let out a gasp, backing away in shock. They stood staring at the cameras in disbelief.
Tim,
Pete gasped, staring around at the scene. I stopped for a second. I looked over the entire crowd without an ounce of regret before turning and heading on. The camcorders sputtered, then powered back on, as the reporters quickly grabbed them and sprinted to catch up with us, continuing to fire questions. Will Ms. Hikari's injuries bar her from competing in the trials? What would possess you to take such a risk given your present Earthborn bodies? We maneuvered and dodged through them as they got closer. Soon it was so congested, it felt like we were jammed inside a box of bodies.
Can you please give us some room?
Pete demanded, fighting his way through the commotion. Yeah, we're trying to see our friend, Sam added.
How concerned are you about Prospect Hikari?
Again, our pleas did little to quell the mob. We squeezed our way through the horde until we finally made our way to the portal door. We almost fell in as the door opened. I balanced myself as the others stumbled in after me. Hello, Mr. Eli. Will you and your friends be retiring early from tonight's festivities? Delta 412 replied with the same emotionless smile he had given me hours earlier. No, I need to get to wherever Sai is, I replied, looking at the wall of tinkering lights and knobs. His eyes went vacant for a lasting second before returning to normal. It was almost as if he had an emotional reaction to my words. Yes, Miss Hikari is in the med sector, room 378, he replied, moving his hand in front of the panel. The lights on the panel changed as we shifted, then went into motion. The elevator was stationary, but it was obvious it was moving. Within a couple of seconds, the elevator stopped as a bell rang out, signifying we had reached our destination. Here we are, he replied, motioning for us to exit. I hope Miss Hikari will recover in time to participate in the trials. I was really looking forward to seeing you guys perform.
It would be a shame if she couldn't participate." I stared at him, limp. I exited, shaking my head, growing more irritated by the second. "Okay, thanks, M412, Sam replied, chasing after me. They stared at me as I threw off my hood with a demeanor that was half angry and half concerned. I continued to watch, exhausted with everything and everyone around me.
"He's right. What if Sai can't compete in the trials? We have to win at least 4 matches. She was one of our best chances,"
Pete replied, adjusting his backpack as he spoke.
"This is terrible."
"Yeah, I mean, it was going to be hard enough with her," Sam seconded. "But without her?" I stopped in my tracks as emotion shot through me like a cold wind. I balled my fists as they walked past me.
"Really? How are we going to win the trials? The trials? Who cares?"
I screamed, finally reaching my breaking point.
"I am beyond acting as if I care about what fancy house we go to. My best friend is in a coma. A coma! Right now, the last thing on my mind is the stupid trials. How about I wonder if Sai is trapped in some place of limbo, if she's hurting? You know what? Forget it. I don't have time for this."
I sighed, staring at the ceiling, trying my best not to look at them. At the time, it was the only thing I could do to keep myself from losing control. "I expected that from the people here," I replied, lowering my head. "To them, we're just show monkeys. But you guys? I expected more from you. We are so caught up in this crap, basking in the glory or conservation of our greatness. Has it dawned on you guys that that arrogance is why Sai's laid up in the medcorps right now? We let our guard down. We were so busy admiring how great a legion we were, so busy showing off that we weren't ready. We didn't fight like a legion. We fought like show-offs. No planning, no working together, just arrogant hot-dogging. We dropped the ball because of this crap. Can't you guys see that? It's going to our heads, and Sai paid the price for it. Now she could be paralyzed inside her own body or worse, and all I keep hearing about is this stupid competition, living up to some hype. It's all bull. We're not some super team. We're not prodigies. We're a group of kids from Angel Haven. I just can't believe you guys have forgotten that so soon. And even worse, I can't believe Sai doesn't mean more to you guys. Pete, I know how much you care about Sai, but I'm disappointed in you. Sam, Sai was there for you when no one else was. If either of you were lying in a bed unconscious, Sai would never... I clenched my fist, trying my best to hold back the forming tears in my eyes.
"Tim, I didn't mean it like..."
Pete uttered before relenting apologetically with a nod. I threw my hood over my head to shield my face and visible emotion. "I just can't right now," I replied, adjusting my backpack to make my exit. They stared at me with regretful demeanors as I barged past, shouldering them out of my way. Eve and Beth followed right on my tail, jogging to keep up. I continued up the hall to Sai's room as Pete and Sam both stood motionlessly, staring into space in a remorseful haze. "She's over here," Eve replied, standing in front of the door. I was so out of it that I had walked past the door with her name on it. I turned and headed for it, and Sam and Pete dragged toward it as well. The room was relatively small compared to the places we'd been so far, although it was still more elegant than most hotel rooms. The place was littered with flowers and get-well-soon presents. "It looks like she's been here for weeks," Eve replied. "Get well soon? The mayor of Quadrant AZN-BGA? We're counting on you? District TNBZ? Who are all these people?" "They're fans of yours," said a voice, catching us all off guard. I turned to see a beautiful lady in a white doctor's coat. She had long dark hair and stunning light blue eyes. She was the spitting image of Sai. She smiled politely as she gave Eve a pat on the back and checked the computer screen next to Sai's bed. My take was she was Sai's doctor, but she looked familiar. We all stood motionless as the obvious began to occur to us.
Don't all talk at once, she said with a sarcastic raise of her eyebrow. Her words eased the tension as Eve and Beth chuckled bashfully. Who are you? I muttered, already knowing the answer to my question. She chuckled as she stared at us sarcastically. Every nose crinkle, smile, or organic movement was identical to Sai. It was eerie. I think you've figured that out, she replied. Although you may be having a hard time, seeing as the last time you saw me I was probably a little less, alive? As she spoke, the memory came racing back to me. The portal house. She was one of the busts. She was Sai's mom. I couldn't believe it. My mind began to race as it filled with questions I wanted to ask. You're Sai's mother? Pete replied, looking at her like she was a doll. She clicked her teeth and pointed in Pete's direction in a joking manner, signaling he had guessed correctly. Well, technically, I'm a subatomic medic specialist brought in to aid with an Earthborn body, she replied sarcastically. But I guess if we were shooting for labels, Paranoid Mother is a more accurate title, but in my defense, that just doesn't have the same ring to it. Don't you agree? Eve chuckled as I fought to hold back a smile of my own. I see Adam has taught you well, she replied, placing her hand on my head. Caveman 101, never show emotion, but despite what your father says, you know it's okay to smile every now and again. I relented, releasing a genuine smile as she gave me a hug. Gosh, you look just like her, she replied, staring into my eyes. I guess we'll have to call it even. I got to meet you before Leah, and you got to meet me before Sarai. She stood with her arms on her hips, looking at the rest of the crew. With the rest of you, we'll just say I'm the lucky one who got to meet you guys first, she replied with her arms open. They all came in for a group hug. As she got to Sam, she stared into his eyes for a lasting second before catching herself and forcing an awkward smile as she released him from his hug. Ms. Hikari, said a voice, catching me off guard. I turned to see Jacob, Luke, and the rest of the Legion coming in. Jacob, is that you? Sai's mom uttered, staring at him with an endearing smile. You've grown so much! And oh gosh, is that little Luke? They both smiled as they embraced her. It's been ages. What were you, 5 or 6 years old the last time I saw the two of you? She replied rhetorically. Yes, ma'am, Jacob replied, as she held her hand on his and Luke's cheek. She continued to stare at them before planting kisses on both their foreheads. You two are the spitting image of your fathers, both of you. It's uncanny, she replied, staring at them in disbelief. Thanks. This is Uriah Jace and Danielle Michael, Jacob replied, pointing in their direction. Nice to meet you, Danielle replied, extending her hand. Mrs. Hikari accepted her shake with one hand and lovingly covered her hand with the other. So, you're Ambassador Michael's daughter, Mrs. Hikari replied. Yes, ma'am, Danielle replied, looking around consciously. Well, it's nice to meet you, Danielle, Mrs. Hikari greeted, smiling. Uriah stood in limbo, waiting for an opening as Danielle moved to the side. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Hikari, he added, extending his hand. A Jace and an Eli on the same team, Mrs. Hikari replied, smiling. It would take the apocalypse for that to happen, wouldn't it? Uriah and Jacob scratched the back of their heads in an effort to kill the awkwardness. I'm just kidding, she replied, smiling from ear to ear. It's nice to meet you, Uriah. As they spoke, I made my way over to Sai. It was killing me to see her in such a condition. She had a body brace that covered her from her neck down. It was hard to diagnose how bad her injuries were underneath the brace. I grabbed her hand, visibly upset. Is she all right? I replied, interrupting the warm welcome. She stared at me, moved by my concern. Yes, she replied, walking over to Sai and moving her hair from her face. I've used subatomics to knock her soul out for a couple of days. Whenever her body recovers,
The procedure will reverse itself and her soul will re-enter her body. She'll be as good as new. She is a Dominion, but that does absolutely nothing as far as recovery goes. In many cases, it may take longer since her ability is effectively changing her DNA to make her stronger. There is no telling when that'll happen, and even if it does, she won't be in condition to fight for another day or two. I did all I could, but Earthborn bodies are so limited subatomically. My hands were tied. I nodded appreciatively. It took a world of worry off my mind. At least I knew she wasn't suffering, and for the time being it was good news. I continued to stare at her as she lay unconscious. So, I'm guessing with Izzy and Adam, you guys spent a lot of time together? She pressed, staring at my gesture. Yeah, she's my best friend. Well, me, her, and Pete over there, I replied, pointing in Pete's direction. She and Eve are also pretty close too. Sam came along later. I guess, really, you can say with all we've been through together recently, we're all close now. My response seemed to cause an emotional reaction. She covered her mouth, shaking her head poignantly. Wait, so all of you? She replied. Izzy, Peter, Adam, and Sam? She stopped as emotion started to overtake her. Are you okay? Eve replied, concerned. I'm fine, she replied, wiping the faint tears from her eyes. It's just the rest of us always assumed they split up, especially Sam. You know, with me and Leah being gone and all. To make things easier, we have our memories put in stasis while we're on our tours. I'm ashamed to say we were out of the loop, so I really didn't know what to expect. But they kept you all together, even Sammy. Her words caught us all off guard. Even Jacob seemed to be surprised by her response. Wait, what? Sam replied. Me? You're talking about me? She seemed thrown by his attitude. Well, you know, with your parents and all, I figured maybe Adam would have... Her words changed Sam's demeanor. He stared at the ground as emotion filled him. He had little to no memory of his parents. He was far too young to remember them, and never had anyone that was close enough to him to give him insight. It was an overwhelming feeling to hear he had parents. He fought back tears and forced a smile. Sam, is that my mother's name? He replied. Yes, her name is Samantha, Mrs. Hikari shot with a smile. Samantha Corazon. His words sent a pause through the group. We all turned to him with suspicious glances. Sam, you don't know your mother's name. But wait, when we were at the portal house, you said... Eve managed before being cut off. I just didn't want to talk about it, but I didn't know anything about my mother and father. I never have, Sam cut in, staring at the ground. My aunt and uncle never told me anything. Aunt and uncle? Mrs. Hikari replied, thrown. I understand Leah, but Adam never talked to you about your parents? Her words shot through our group like an electrical current. We stared at each other, spinning from her words. Wait, what? I replied, thrown. Why would my dad explain anything to him? She continued to look at us with as much astonishment as we showcased toward her. Well, didn't you say your aunt and uncle? She responded, looking for clarification. Wait, hold on. So you're saying that Tim and Jacob's parents are related to Sam? Pete continued, trying to get clarification. She stared at him, slightly dazed by Pete's question. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Leah's brother was Sam's father, she replied, almost taking my breath away. I knew things were bad, but why wouldn't Adam tell you guys that? Sam stood, emotionlessly staring at the floor. So, Sam is... your cousin, she replied, finishing my sentence with a nod. Her words filled me with pride and confusion at the same time. I was proud to know that Sam was a part of my family, but I was confused as to why we were just finding this out. Well, what about that? Eve replied, placing her hand on Sam and Jacob's shoulders. That's awesome, Jacob replied, throwing his arm over Sam's shoulder.
Welcome to the family." Sam fought back a smile as Jacob squeezed his head and tangled his hair. "Tim is my family. Why wouldn't anybody tell me that? I mean, Leah Eli is my aunt," he questioned.
"My guess is Adam and Izzy were looking for you for some time, and when they finally found you, they found a way to bring you to Angel Haven without letting anyone know who or where you were," Mrs. Hikari replied, continuing to zing us like piñatas on a string. "To do that, they had to keep their distance because they were being constantly watched. They probably did it to protect you." Sam stared with a look of concern and shock as he continued.
"Why would they need to protect me?" he replied, asking the same question we were all thinking.
"It's a long story, dear. I mean," she replied, as if to be filtering herself for the first time. "Well, if they knew that Leah Eli's nephew was alive, I mean, it wouldn't be safe, and with Adam being so high profile, it was probably the only way he could think to protect you."
All my life I lived on the outside observing people, and over the years I had grown astute at reading the people I observed. I could tell when someone was reeling, and Mrs. Hikari was a prime example. She fidgeted with Sai's machine to avoid making eye contact. She was being deceptive, and I knew why. She was hiding something about Sam.
"But what about the rest of us?" Eve replied. "We were all with our parents?" "Well, yes, but you were born into it," she replied, fumbling to backtrack over her words. "Sam could live free of this, and he still had you guys, so they probably figured he'd be all right."
It could have been my ability or plain intuition, but I could see there was a connection between Sam's father and Sam's protection. There's no way my dad would have left Sam alone, let alone not tell us he was our cousin unless he didn't want us to know. Why would he want Sam secluded unless he had a reason? Why was he and his family missing in the first place? I dissected every word and physical characteristic over and over in my mind until it started to make sense. I wanted to voice my suspicion, but Sam was happy for once to know he had a family, and for now, there was no reason to mess that up.
"Yeah, it's probably the same reason they never told any of us about this stuff to begin with," Pete added, obviously covering.
I nodded inconspicuously. He returned it with a wink. Sam seemed to buy the story as he nodded in agreeing. Eve looked around the room like we were all crazy. "Eve, don't," I replied via BAU before she could speak.
"What? Why?" she replied.
"We know something isn't right about the story, but Sam doesn't and doesn't need to. There is obviously some type of connection between all this and Sam's father. But for now, let's just let Sam be happy," I explained. Eve tilted her head slightly, signaling she agreed. As we finished our spat, Jacob ringed in. "Mrs. Hikari?" he muttered, looking around subconsciously. She turned to him with a suspiciously sympathetic demeanor.
"Yes, go ahead, Jacob," she replied in a motherly tone.
"Well, I know you said you were here for Sai, but what about the rest of our parents? Where are they?" he asked, gun-shy. "I mean, if you're here, then why couldn't they come? Didn't they want to see us?" His words weren't followed, but you could tell we were all eager to learn the answer to the questions asked. It was gnawing at us from the moment she arrived. She placed her hand on her head dramatically, as if to be prepping herself.
"Honey, it's not like that at all," she replied empathetically. "Any of them would have given anything to be here. As I said before, their memories are in stasis. At present, they don't even remember they have children. They won't remember you guys until they come back."
"Well, why aren't they here?" Eve replied, echoing what we were all thinking. She shook her head solemnly.
"Our realm, your realm, is called the Seville realm. It houses more galaxies than you can imagine. Some similar to ours in age and makeup, some vastly different, some older and some younger. The Light Guard patrols all these galaxies. We are the Light Guard. We signed up for it when we were younger than you. We went through the academy to not only help our worlds, but all worlds. You'll understand after you've been here a couple of years. I'm sure Max has explained the story to you, but much like us, I'm sure you didn't understand the physics of it all, so allow me to bore you further. Soul beings are the purest form of energy from God. We are the only beings to house a piece of God in us, His breath. Thus, upon Adam receiving his breath, he was made in God's image. This made him a full being, and made us one of the most powerful creations in existence. We, like the angels, have a responsibility. We keep people safe, and much like the Watchers, we facilitate and monitor new and old civilizations. We have responsibilities that we can't abandon because we may want to do things. That's how the Watchers fell. It is our job. I was only allowed out because of the goodness of Father Yahweh to send someone in my place. It gave me enough time to come and look over Sarai, but even now I only have a couple minutes. I won't be able to stay around until she recovers. She walked over to Sai and softly kissed her forehead. Is my father with you guys? I asked, looking her in the eye. Yes, all your parents are. We have been together for the past 30 years, she replied. Remember, one day is 30 days here, so for every one day they spent with you guys, they spent 30 days here. So once the rapture started, they came back to their post like they did for the last 30 years. I nodded, appreciating her answer. She ran her hand through Sai's head once more before turning back to us. Let me get one last hug to take to your parents, she replied, extending her arms. We all converged on her as she alternated between pecks and pats before finally letting us go. You guys be careful, she replied as she stretched her arms around us in a group hug. We'll be rooting for you. I acknowledged her words with a smile. She turned as if she didn't want to leave. She stared at Sai as she walked out the door. Tell my baby that I love her, she replied, disappearing into a bright light. The light evaporated into thin air, leaving an empty hallway which was reminiscent of how we all were probably feeling on the inside. I was emotionally paralyzed, as if a ghost with a secret to my past had just appeared and disappeared, leaving more questions than answers. The room was silent until Jacob exited without speaking. His exit seemed to open the floodgate as everyone filed out one by one. I clenched Sai's hand one last time before fixing her bed covers before I exited. I was so out of it. The elevator ride back to the room was silent as me, Sam, and Pete leaned against the walls in a haze. We exited the elevator without as much as a hello or goodbye. The doors opened just in time for us to see Luke and Uriah head into their rooms. I walked up to our door, and before the beam could even finish its lock on me, I forced my way through the door. I headed to my room and slammed my door. A couple seconds later, I could hear Sam and Pete's doors close as well. My shower was a blur. I replayed the meeting over and over in my head until it was nauseating. I stared at the ceiling. It didn't take me long to fall asleep. My body was exhausted from the simulation, and with Sai's injury, the press, and the news from Mrs. Hikari, I was an emotional mess. It felt good to have my mind and my body rest for a little while.